Welcome to this Labor Day weekend edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that celebrates labor, but not by taking a day off, by understanding what labor means and why it's so great for the American exceptionalist mindset and all the things that we have managed to do, not just in this Commonwealth, but across the country and building our prosperity. Now, we've got a great program this week. We're titling this week's program Lawyers, Guns, and Money, and starting with the drug importation, re-importation plans in the administration, taking us inside this and laying it across one of the great minds not named Adam Smith in economics, Milton Friedman. To do this is Phil Kerpen of American Commitment. Phil, welcome back to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing great, Joe. How are you?
I'm doing very well. And you wrote a great piece, Why Milton Friedman Rightly Opposed Drug Re-Importation. First off, let's go into the idea of drug re-importation and explain what the concept is, and then we'll get into the specifics of Milton Friedman and his opposition to it.
Well, the drug companies typically charge very high prices for their patented innovator drugs, the drugs that are protected from generic competition in the United States. And they do that because the United States is the one market in the world where you can really charge market prices, and therefore the one place you can recover the billions of dollars that it costs to develop and get FDA approval for a new drug and bring it to market, and a return on capital for your investors. And then they price discriminate in other countries. They charge much lower prices basically everywhere else in the world. And they do that because foreign governments have various price control regimes and government-run healthcare systems, and they basically say, we will not pay a market price. You will take this much lower price, or you will not sell your drug at all. And the drug companies typically go along with that because, from their perspective, if they can make, their major profits in the U.S. market, it's additional accretion, it's additional profit to sell abroad, even at much lower prices, right. even at price-controlled prices, because the alternative would be not selling at all in those other countries. And so, as long as it's above their marginal cost of producing more pills, it's profitable for them to sell abroad at much lower prices while they're making most of their money back in the U.S. market.
And I'm glad you said making their money back, because it's such an infuriating argument to hear people say it only costs pennies to make this pill that costs me. But I forget, the economist said this. He said the second through 9 millionth pill may cost a few bucks to make, but it's that first one.
The first one's about $2.6 billion.
Exactly. So I don't want to have to pay for that. But recouping that cost of the innovation.
And a return on capital, profit for your investors as well. Or you don't do it.
Who have lent you the money to go on. Yeah, because you need money. And there's also the cost of all the trial and error in the medications that never pan out even.
Well, that's embedded in that average. So when I say the average is $2.6 billion to bring a new drug to market, that includes all the money that's spent on sort of
trial
balloons. That's kind of all the trial and errors built into that, and all the regulatory approval and so forth. That number's from Tufts University. They do it every few years. When Milton Friedman talked about this issue, the estimate from Tufts was $800 million per new drug approval, and then about 10 or 15 years later, they redid the study, updated it, and they were up to $2.6 billion. And that was 2015, so it might be even more now. It's probably continued to rise. But we've got this circumstance where the rest of the world is paying much, much less than we do, because they have various forms of government price controls, government-run systems, and it is, in a sense, fundamentally unfair. They ought to be paying market-based prices in other countries. And by the way, if they didn't have price controls for drugs in other countries, and there were profits to be made globally, similar to U.S. profits, we'd have a lot more drugs. We'd have dozens more drugs developed every single year, and we'd all be much better off for it. We'd have cures for all kinds of things that don't exist now if there were global returns on research and development comparable to U.S. returns. And so it would actually be great for everyone, very highly beneficial for the entire world, if the other rich countries would loosen their price controls. And that really ought to be our policy goal, and you can only accomplish that through trade negotiations. But we've got this concept on both the right and left, going back many years now, and President Trump has recently embraced it. This idea that, well, if Canada's paying much less than we are, then we ought to pay Canadian prices, and so why don't we just require that the drugs that are exported to Canada can be re-imported into the United States, and then we'll pay the Canadian price, and U.S. consumers will save a lot of money. And so that's what the Trump administration is now proposing, and this is something that's been proposed for many years, including back during the Bush administration when Milton Friedman was asked about it. And this interview was kind of hard to find. It's like not on the internet anymore, but I found it through the archive.org. But it was very interesting, and Milton Friedman was asked about this. And usually, Joe, when you have this debate, people who are for reimportation say it's a free trade issue, and we should be allowed to buy from abroad. And people who are against reimportation will typically say, the issue is price controls, and the foreign price is a price control price, and we don't want to bring price controls into the U.S. And Milton Friedman rejected both of those arguments. He said it's not a price control, but it's also not a free trade issue. The issue in his mind was patents, and the argument that he made is, look, a patent, the whole purpose of a patent is that it grants exclusivity to the patent holder for the U.S. market. We basically say, look, if you're going to spend the billions of dollars, or back when he was saying it was $800 million, it's now in the billions. If you're going to spend hundreds of millions or billions of dollars to develop a new drug, you're going to be rewarded by a patent that will allow you to have exclusive rights to sell that product in the U.S. market, and that's how you'll make back your hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. And that's the system that we've adopted for incentivizing research and development and discovery of new cures. Fundamental to that, if a patent means anything, it means the legal right to exclude competition. It means someone else can't come in with a generic before your patent expires. Someone else can't come in with counterfeits and undercut your pricing power, your ability to make back that R&D and make a profit on it. And reimportation essentially violates that patent right because it forces you to compete with your own product that's being reimported against your wishes at a much lower price because you've legally and rationally from an economic standpoint decided to sell at a lower price in another country. The government policy of forcing that back into the U.S. market undermines your exclusive right to sell, which is the fundamental meaning of a patent, and therefore, your ability to do R&D and develop new cures and bear the burden of all of those costs that the FDA imposes in the regulatory process. And the reason I wrote a column, it's not even much of a column. It's basically just like 6 quotes from Milton Friedman with a couple sentences.
Which
of
is
my
worth
analysis,
it.
Joe. But the reason I put it out there is this perspective is like totally missing from the debate right now. No one is pointing out, hey, why do we have patents in the first place? And if the reason is to incentivize R&D and the development of new cures, you've got to have a period of exclusivity to recoup that investment. And if you force a drug maker to compete with its own product that's coming in at a much lower price, you undermine that. And one of two things would happen. They're not going to keep selling into Canada at a much lower price than the U.S. price if all the drugs just come back into the U.S. and they have to compete with it. They'll stop selling into Canada. They'll restrict supplies. And so, if anything, I think that it'll actually lead to higher prices in the U.S. Because they'll no longer be able to get even that additional little bit of profit from selling at lower prices in Canada because they'll have to pull out of the Canadian market, which, by the way, could cause a diplomatic crisis of sorts as well.
And a health crisis if medications are not available. Too often, Phil, and we're visiting with Phil Kerpen of American Commitment, and he's been out on the front lines of this, even when Joe Walsh was a conservative. Phil is wrote a great piece on Milton Friedman's opposition to drug reimportation, and it seems so straightforward, but so often in the subject of patent protection for pharmaceutical innovation, I hear people comparing in some of the most egregious apples to oranges arguments about it, saying, well, Gunlock can't patent the office chair, can they? Even if they make it for the president. But you're comparing furniture to a pharmaceutical that, takes years and years, if not decades, to perfect, to find safe and usable applications, to find it where it's successful at a high enough rate. They like to compare a pharmaceutical innovation to all these other consumer products, and I just don't think that's fair to do.
Well, here's the thing. I happen to believe in intellectual property sort of as a philosophical matter.
Sure,
I agree with John
absolutely.
Locke that a person ought to own the product of his own mind and his own efforts, and I think that's a natural right. And some people disagree on that. Some people prefer sort of a strictly economic analysis that sort of looks at property rights as at intellectual property as sort of a government grant of monopoly as a sort of regulatory system. Some libertarians take that view. We could debate that. It doesn't really matter in my view, though, because as Madison pointed out, and I think it was Federalist 54, in this case, the natural rights view coincides perfectly with the utilitarian view. The reason the patent clause is in the Constitution is the founders recognized, look, we want to incentivize the discovery of useful inventions, and in order to incentivize that so that society can benefit from it in a utilitarian sense, it makes sense to protect this right and to enshrine it in the Constitution, and that's why they did that. And so I don't think it matters too much whether you take the philosophical view or the utilitarian view, and we could sort of set aside the whole question of whether there's a natural property right in invention and just say, look, from a totally practical perspective, how are you going to incentivize people to spend, the average $2.6 billion to develop a new drug? And I would love to get that cost down through FDA reforms. We could probably get it down significantly. But whatever the number ends up being, you have to have this question of how do you pay for it? How do you structure that? And there are alternatives. Patents are not the only way. Some people have said you could do it with big prizes, or I guess you could do it just by hugely expanding, the federal NIH budget and university grants and try to do it all through government. But I think that those alternatives would be far less efficient and far less effective than the patent-based system that we've had. You look at the results in the United States, we're driving almost all the pharmaceutical innovation in the world, and we've done pretty remarkable things. I mean, the medical advances, what's happened in the pharmaceutical space has been sort of like the key driver, I think, of innovation and improvement in health and well-being in this country. And we've had all kinds of miracle cures. Most recently, hepatitis C was cured, and so I think there should be a really high burden, really heavy hurdle on anyone who suggests that we weaken the patent system that we have right now, and they ought to be very specific on how, if we did adopt a system that would sort of undercut pricing power and the ability of innovators to exploit their patents to get high returns to justify that R&D. How do we replace it? What do we replace it with? How do we ensure that R&D in the development of new cures remains robust? And I don't see that in any of these importation proposals. They've got this idea that we can just sort of find this way to circumvent a patent and get drugs into the U.S. at a much lower price, and they don't offer any suggestion. Even if it worked, and I don't think it would, because I think they would restrict supply into Canada, as I said, but let's say for the purpose of a thought experiment that it works exactly as intended and drug prices for innovator drugs come down dramatically in the U.S. If that happened, what would we replace the incentive? What would we replace the value of the patent with to keep R&D spending strong and development of new cure? We would have to replace it with something, and that piece seems to be missing from these proposals.
I also, point out to people when we debate these issues that the pharmaceutical companies are some of the most philanthropic as well, because there's a faction of the left who loves to, pillory anything big. It's the vestiges of Occupy Wall Street, and anything that's a big corporation with shareholders has got to be inherently evil somehow, Phil. And I point out to the fact, very quietly, without a lot of hullabaloo, organizations like the United Way work with all of these pharmaceutical companies on scholarship, programs. I don't know if scholarship is the right word for it, but benefit programs, so that if somebody is income challenged but needs, as you mentioned, hepatitis C, medicine or any of them, that they can get it through these plans that are usually run through your local, whether it's United Way or whoever it might be. But these pharmaceutical companies, you can even often talk to the hospitals about it. I had Lovenox because I had a blood clot in the midst of chemotherapy, and it's enormously expensive because it's very specific, and it's really something you would take only if you're in chemotherapy while with a blood clot. But the pharmaceutical manufacturer was able to come up with a benefit program where I was paying, a greatly reduced price for it through just asking and saying, here's my income level. So this idea that the pharmaceutical companies are robber barons who are just getting rich while the rest of us are getting sick is crazy.
Well, they do a tremendous amount of price discrimination. They charge people who are able to pay very, very, very high prices, and they charge people who are not able or not willing to pay those prices much lower prices. And you can only do that when you have a government-sanctioned monopoly. When you have a patent in place and no one can compete with you, you can charge highly variable prices. And by the way, that's economically efficient. Mm-hmm. That's desirable. If you're trying to incentivize the development of new cures and R&D and so forth, you want them to be able to totally maximize profits for that time period that they've got exclusivity. And in order to maximize profits, they need to be able to charge pretty variable prices, not just internationally, as we were talking about, but also even domestically within any given country. They want to charge as much as they can get any payer to bear, but they don't want to lose anyone. They want everyone to pay whatever they can pay. And that's kind of what their economic incentive is, to maximize that. And when we talk about pharmaceutical patents are 20 years, but they actually have a much smaller window of exclusivity because the FDA approval process can take 10 years, and they don't actually get to market anywhere near the beginning of that 20-year window. And so they really need to max out all of the opportunity for revenue that they have before generic competition comes in and prices totally collapse. And we've got a pretty good balance now in the U.S. We've got a pretty good system. I know it can be painful when you're paying high out-of-pocket costs, as we often are. And I think the best proposal the administration had was the one to take a lot of the rebates that the middlemen are siphoning off out of the system and require that any rebates be passed on to end customers, which was something they backed off after a tremendous amount of pressure from the insurance companies and the pharmaceutical benefit managers. I'd like to see that proposal come back because if we take a lot of the money that's being siphoned by middlemen, force that to be passed on to end consumers, we could lower prices significantly at the register without taking any money out of the pockets of manufacturers, and therefore without undermining the incentive for R&D and the development of new cures. And so that proposal I liked a lot, and I think would help a lot. But a lot of these other proposals that are out there, if you undermine the ability for price discrimination or you impose any kind of price controls, as others have proposed in the U.S. system, you're going to get less R&D and you're going to get less cures. There's no way around that unless you replace it with some other source of funding, which most of these proposals do not do.
Phil Kerpen, AmericanCommitment.org. This great column, as he says, with humility. It's just really kind of re-quoting something Milton Friedman said years ago on re-importation of drugs. You mentioned the FDA approval process, and it's an interesting part of this administration who signed the right to try legislation but has been slow to look at FDA approvals. Would that help lower costs as well? You talked about a window on a pharmaceuticals patent gets shrunk drastically while it waits for FDA approval, while other countries seem to have much more open mindsets towards the idea that a business isn't going to put something out there that's going to make all their customers unwell. Is that something you would encourage the administration to look at?
Yeah, I think that would be hugely beneficial. Look, I mean, if you want to get down the costs that we pay for prescription drugs, there are really two things that the government can do with respect to FDA. They can lower the costs of compliance of getting a new drug to market, and they could speed the timeline, because the more years that you have an exclusive right to sell a product, the more you have an ability, to spread out those costs over a number of years before generic competition comes in, and therefore, you're going to get downward pressure on price, as long as it's not the only drug that's available for a given condition, between manufacturers, between different drugs, that's going to tend to push down the price even during the exclusive period, and they're going to be able to still make a return on investment at a lower price because it'll be spread out over more years if you speed the approval process. And I would frankly like to see, building on the idea of right to try, I would like to see drugs be available for people who are not necessarily terminally ill, even prior to final FDA approval. If they've been through phase 1, we know that they've been proven safe, then I think that the efficacy questions that we find in phase 2 and phase 3 trials, shouldn't prevent people from being able to get access to medicines. And in particular, given all the technology that we have now, we could probably get much better information about which drugs work and for what.
And faster.
By getting them on the market instead of just through clinical trials, and share the information we see from actual patients in the real world. Because so many drugs are used for off-label purposes anyway. So even after they go through all of that extensive approval process, the doctors end up using them for something else that they were never approved for.
There was a hair growth product it was a little blue pill that was going to help you grow hair. I don't think it's used for growing hair anymore, Phil. But Phil Kerpen, American Commitment, thank you so much for your time this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio, and continue the great work at AmericanCommitment.org. And we'll talk to you again very soon.
All right, Joe. Have a good one. Thanks.
More drugs in the next segment. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. If you had a phrase that said, we need to ban blank, and we need common sense controls on who can access blank, there are many among us who would immediately hear the word gun. But that phrase is also often used about opioids. Are they equivalent? We're going to visit with Jonathan Blanks, Research Associate on Criminal Justice from the Cato Institute on guns, opioids, and fear that's driving policy on it next on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.